Anna, are you about ready to get started?
Yep.
Awesome.
I'm ready.
I'm just going to go ahead and kick us off then. So thank you again, everyone, for your patience while we navigate this brave new world. My name is Tessa Minshew, and I'm going to be your on-camera moderator for this session. And you are in remote work and technical services. What have we learned? Where are we going? So we're going to hold the Q&A until the end. So if you have questions for Anna, please just drop them into the chat. My colleague Erica is in there, and she'll be gathering your questions. We'll work in a shared document together. And please just take it away, Anna.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tessa. And thanks to all the NC Serials folks who are making all this happen. So this session is called Remote Work and Technical Services. What have we learned? Where are we going? And there's a go link at the bottom of the slides, go.uncg.edu/NCSC 2022. The slides have also been loaded in Whova if y'all would like to consult them there. So this is me. I'm Anna Kraft. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the coordinator of scholarly communications in the university libraries at UNC Greensboro. And I'd like to start with a brief land acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge the lasting legacies of slavery and settler colonialism on the land on which I live and work in what is now Greensboro, North Carolina. This land has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst a number of indigenous peoples, including the Ino, Kiawe, Occaneechi, Sara, and Shakori. North Carolina has been home to many indigenous peoples at different points in time, and I would like to honor and respect the diverse peoples who are connected to this territory from which I'm speaking to you today. And I also want to recognize that it's impossible to separate the history of this land from the long history and lasting legacy of slavery in this country, and particularly where I live in the American South. And the image that you see here on the left is the land that I work on. That's the UNCG campus. That image was taken in 1972, and it's from our special collections and university archives at UNCG. So what is this about? I wrote a column for the journal Serials Review about 2 years ago. It was called Remote Work and Library Technical Services, Connecting Historical Perspectives to Realities of the Developing COVID-19 Pandemic. And there are two links here. One will take you to the version of record, that DOI, that first link in the journal, which you may or may not have full access to depending on subscriptions. The second link will take you to an OA version in our institutional repository that everyone should have access to, should you wish to read it. So as we get started, I have a couple of questions for y'all. And I'm going to use Mentimeter to do this. So if you would go to www.menti.com, and you'll be asked for a code. It is 71747851. And if you go to that link, you'll have the opportunity to answer two questions. You'll see them one at a time. The first one is, do you work in technical services? If so, what areas of technical services? If not, where are you based? And after that, you will have the opportunity to answer, before COVID, was remote work part of your workplace culture? So if you're able to go to that, this is completely anonymous, unless you enter your name or something. So if you would, go to Menti, enter the code, and answer the questions if you wish. And I'm going to click through to the results to see if those are starting to come in. This just may take a second for this to load. And the code again is 71747851. And it's thinking about it. So this gives us a little time to get some of those answers into the system. Okay. So yes, we're seeing some answers: acquisition, serials, cataloging, more cataloging, administrations, acquisitions. All right, e-resources, metadata, special collections processing, ILL serials. Awesome. So we've got a lot of people here who are in technical services, and also some who are in other areas. I'm seeing ROI, sounds like research, outreach, and instruction, e-serials cataloging, government documents cataloging. Great, so we've got a lot of tech services folks here doing a lot of different things. Thank y'all for all these answers. I look forward to seeing everything that is put in. Okay, so in the interest of time, I am gonna go ahead and go to the next one. Although things are still coming in, I kind of want to see what they are. Acquisitions, lots of acquisitions. Okay, so these are starting to start over. All right, so we're gonna go to the next one. Before COVID, was remote work part of your workplace culture? I'm seeing a lot of no's. No, 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 no. My institution did not and still does not have a work from home policy. I see one yes, a no, not really, not often and only for faculty. Yeah, okay, yes, but much less. No, it was discouraged. This is really interesting, thank you. I appreciate all the comments here, only partially. And lots of no's. All right, so I'm gonna go back to the slides now. Thank y'all for doing this. This is actually the first time that I have done a Menti in a presentation. Other times that I've been involved, co-presenters have done them. So I appreciate y'all participating and giving me the chance to test this out. Okay, so back to the slides. All right, so a little bit of context. Where I work at UNCG, we have the university libraries comprise two libraries, the main library, which is called Jackson Library, and the music library, Harold Schiffman Music Library. And together we're staffed with approximately 90 full-time equivalent employees. And we're involved in a lot of collaborative interinstitutional projects, things like the Carolina Consortium and the shared NC Docs institutional repository. And I want to acknowledge that technical services can mean a lot of different things to different people and to different institutions. I think we saw some of that in that initial question with some of the differences and things that people were saying were involved in technical services. So at UNCG, tech services includes acquisitions, cataloging and metadata, e-resources, scholarly communications, and some other things, plus a lot of collaborative interdepartmental work with other library units and with groups on campus. So we do a lot of things. And when you say technical services at UNCG, you might be referring to a group of people, me and my colleagues, to a suite of activities and services, the things that we do, or to a specific location, the place where we work in the building. So we primarily have one large open workspace where personnel and technical services work. And we have 17 full-time personnel, including staff, faculty, and temporary workers. If you want to know more about us, there's a Go link there that will take you to more info about tech services at UNCG. And before the pandemic, almost everyone in my unit worked pretty much exclusively in person in our open office work area in Jackson Library. Of course, there were things like, you go to a meeting, it's outside of the department, it's not in the open work area, but all of our workspaces were pretty much in that open work area. And we did not have a remote work culture, excuse me, in my unit or in my library. So it was very in-person focused. Remote work had only been allowed in pretty limited circumstances, both in the libraries overall and technical services, and in my awareness on campus. There may be situations that I don't know about, but it seems like it was a very in-person culture on my campus. And that included meetings also. So our meetings were pretty much held exclusively in person. And that included in the library and on campus. We would, there might be occasional online meetings when there were groups that included people off campus, but pretty much at UNCG on campus, in-person work culture. That, of course, all changed in mid-March of 2020. So our residential halls closed, our face-to-face classes were suspended and moved online. Campus buildings, including the library, were closed. Events were canceled, and there was a transition to remote work for most employees pretty much overnight. It was a huge change. And of course, this was happening at a time when lots of other changes and stressors were occurring related to COVID. Back to that column on remote work. So here's that title again with those links. And to be clear, I'm not an expert on remote work, but I am interested in this area, especially in relation to technical services, and I've been making an effort to learn. Why did I write this? So it was spring 2020. I write a regular column twice a year for the journal Serials Review, and I was trying to come up with a column idea. My library had recently transitioned to remote work, remote services, remote instruction. My department, we were having a lot of conversations in online meetings and via email about how to handle our work in this new remote environment. It was a big change for everyone, and it was very much on people's minds. And I had this column deadline that was coming up, and I was really having a hard time focusing and having a hard time thinking about anything other than the pandemic and the new remote work situation. So since I was thinking so much about all of this stuff, I decided to try to look into connecting those topics for this column. But before I could propose that as an idea, I had to look at what had already been written. Was there literature about remote work and technical services? And if so, was there enough to make it worth writing about? So this column that I write is called Electronic Resources Forum. I'm not an e-resources librarian, so I take generally a pretty broad interpretation of what e-resources means, and sometimes I open up the focus to include the larger tech services. And my main interest with this was remote work and its impact on library personnel and tech services departments. Of course, the impact on libraries and other departments and library users is important as well, but that wasn't the focus with what I was doing here. And I was wondering if the existing literature on remote work in technical services, if it did exist, could inform the experience of us transitioning to remote work in the pandemic. There were also things I was not trying to do. I wasn't trying to understand the entire history of remote work in all types of libraries and library departments. I wasn't trying to tell anyone how to do remote work. I wasn't trying to get into the history of pandemics or other public health issues that may have affected libraries. And I definitely wasn't trying to predict the future of how the pandemic would ultimately affect us in libraries and in tech services units. So does anybody have any guesses? In early 2020, what do you think you found if you searched for articles on remote work and library technical services? And I know we can't use the Zoom chat in the same way in this, so I will move on here. In short, you didn't find very much. I didn't have the forethought to do a screen cap at the time that I was doing the searching, but this is what I found when I did one of my searches again last year. So I was initially searching in 2020. These results are from 2021. And the first thing that you see here is the column that I wrote. And of course, I'm sure some of this has to do with Google's algorithms and that it's me that's searching. But when you look at some of the other titles, you see some of my terms: remote work, technical services, library, but you're not seeing these things all together, except in that first one. And when I did this in Academic Search Complete, again, this is from last year, the only result I got was the column that I wrote. And of course, these weren't the only search strings that I was doing. I had to change my searches and dive in some other ways to try to find some results. I was getting a lot of suggestions from Google about other things that I might be looking for that were kind of related, but they weren't exactly what I was trying to get at. Many of the top results that I found with these searches were about remote work in non-library settings, or maybe library services for remote users or distance learners. There were some changes and variation in terminology with that. Remote access to electronic library collections, remote locations for technical services, where maybe a tech services unit has been moved out of a main building to a satellite location. and then remote reference services, libraries in remote locations, and library services for remote communities. So there's some terminology that's the same with what I was looking for, but none of these are about what I needed. But there were luckily at least some articles that addressed both remote work and library technical services. Otherwise, I would not be here talking about this today. So what did I find? We're going to break it down by the types of literature that were available, by dates and terminology that was used, by the type of technical services that's discussed, and then planning considerations, challenges, and benefits that the literature reflects relating to remote work. The types of literature that informed this column, there were several case studies that documented technical services remote work, maybe involving a single person, or maybe involving a whole department where they're writing about testing out or arranging this implementation of this new remote work practice for a person or a department. There were some reports from conference discussions about technical services remote work. And then there was some more kind of generalist library literature that wasn't solely about tech services, but was relevant enough in terms of being about remote work or remote workers in libraries. What I didn't find was anything about deploying tech services remotely at scale. These were all pretty small scale things. And I do want to acknowledge that the literature doesn't reflect everything. It only reflects what's published, and that does not include all perspectives. Not all library personnel write, present, or publish about their experiences, so the literature only tells part of the story. And historically, there are people within libraries whose perspectives have been minoritized and who are also not included. So we're only working with what we see in the published literature, and that's not everything. There are some other limitations too. At the time I was initially doing the searching, I didn't have access to my physical library. I was just working online. And full text online access was not available for some things that sounded promising. And print collections all over the place were closed due to lockdowns. So that was a limitation. And then the literature I did find was very focused on academic libraries, which was good for me. That's relevant to my situation. But of course, technical services is not just an academic libraries thing. It's in all kinds of libraries. And then it's entirely possible that I missed some things. So what did I find? According to the literature, remote work in library technical services was being discussed, tested, and implemented as early as the 1990s, according to literature, on a limited basis. So I found some articles that were published in 95, 96, and 98. What this tells me is that the actual implementations that they're writing about were happening at least a little bit earlier. And so I wasn't in the library field at this time, but I do remember as a teenager, trying to access the internet, and it was nothing like what we have now. So I have a really hard time imagining what remote work was like at that time. The resources that would have been available, the processes, the services, just the internet itself, this would have been remote work in a very different sort of setup. And the literature reflects one particular area within technical services as testing and publishing about these early implementations of remote work. And I was a little bit surprised about which area I saw the most scholarship from. That area was cataloging. So there are, a couple of reasons that this might have been happening. Potentially, maybe there were more faculty in the cataloging area within technical services units, and they were the ones who were expected to publish, where perhaps people in other areas might not have had that expectation. So that could have been some of it. But I was a little surprised that cataloging was the area that I found the most literature about. There were, of course, other areas reflected. E-resources, that is one that I was expecting to see more of, and I did see some. I also saw that terminology really changed over time. I would never have thought to search for telecataloging. And telecommuting, I'm aware of that term, but it's not something that's part of my current lexicon. It was, though, reflected in the literature that I found. So as I was getting into this and doing my searching and finding things and following citations, I was finding different terms than I expected, or different terms than I would have initially thought to look for. Other strings that I saw: cataloging coast to coast, flexibility in the management of cataloging, flexible staffing, working from afar. And one thing I want to bring out there is that flexibility often appeared in conjunction with remote work. So remote work doesn't necessarily include flexible schedules. Remote work might be expected to be on a normal 8 or 9 to 5 kind of schedule. But in a number of these articles that I was finding, these two things were implemented together, where you had both remote work and a flexible schedule or a flexible schedule option that were being tested out. What else can we learn from the literature? Planning was reflected as being very important. And this, of course, is something that we didn't have the opportunity to really do in the way that we would have wanted to with the way that the pandemic came on. So the literature reflects the importance of planning and having institutional and departmental policies in place, thinking through liability considerations, the importance of thinking about technology planning in terms of what's needed, what's going to be provided, who is going to provide it, or who might be reimbursed for providing it. And then things like having in place agreement on tasks, schedule, time frame. Is this going to be a short-term sort of test placement? Is this going to be because somebody's family member is sick and they need to be home to provide care? Is this going to be performance evaluate, or what's the performance evaluation going to be? And then some institutions, the literature reflects them requiring a memorandum of understanding or a memorandum of agreement, or some kind of written agreement to put in place a remote work arrangement. The literature also reflects challenges. And what's interesting to me here is that all of these pre-pandemic challenges are things that we also saw, in my experience, during the earlier part, and maybe even continuing into later parts of the pandemic. So technology being a major challenge, and that you can look at in a couple of different ways, whether or not it's do people have the technology? Do they have the internet? Do they have all the systems that they need to do their work? And maybe they're having to learn to use new systems as they start that new remote work situation. Isolation was mentioned as a challenge, and this was definitely exacerbated by the pandemic, where we weren't just, working at home. We were sometimes on lockdown and not really seeing anyone potentially in certain situations. The literature also reflects challenges or changes around socialization within departments in pre-pandemic literature about remote work. Some examples of that from the literature, things like maybe where a department was implementing remote work and flexible schedules, they saw that employees were less likely to come and participate in professional development on campus or team building things on campus if they didn't have to. And maybe there was less opportunity to kind of develop some of those relationships and team building things that there previously had been an expectation of. There are also documented challenges around work-life balance, where when you are suddenly working and living in the same place, some of those lines can get blurry. That definitely was a challenge, or has been a challenge, maybe even continues to be a challenge during the pandemic. And equity is the one that I want to bring out a little bit more. So in institutional settings, organizations are generally providing our physical facilities, our technology, our internet access, our desks, our chairs, all of the things that we need to do, or the things we need to do our jobs. But not all organizations provide all of these things or financial support for these things to personnel who work remotely. So in some situations, this can essentially reserve remote work for personnel who can provide these resources themselves. And that can be an equity issue. The literature also reflects potential benefits associated with remote work. Flexibility came up a number of times with employees looking for and appreciating flexibility related to remote work, and sometimes related to those flexible schedules I mentioned as well. The potential to improve employee morale, maybe to increase efficiency, to improve retention. None of these things are presented as guarantees, but they are reflected as benefits that people saw in the published literature. And there's also the potential for employers to rethink physical spaces. So if you're not working in the dedicated office space, maybe you don't need a space and could have a temporary space when you are there, which could allow those employers to attain some savings or to rethink some of those physical spaces. So that's all pre-pandemic. What has been published on this topic in the meantime? We've got two screen caps here. The one on the left is my search results from about a year ago. The one on the right is my search results from a week or two ago. They're not very different. These are both with the same search string, remote work, technical services, library. The one on the left, you see about 1.5 million results. On the right, this newer one, we've got a lot more results, almost 1.9 million, but not much in terms of really relevant things. We see, again, some of those words, remote, technical services, library, but not really being about remote work in library technical services. And I saw the same thing when I repeated this search in Academic Search Complete with this particular string. I only got this one result, which is the column that I wrote. So these recent searches that I didn't find much new literature that was relevant on this topic, but that column that I wrote has been getting cited. So I know that somebody is writing at least something that's at least kind of related. So in looking at those citations, I saw a lot of library-based things, but they weren't necessarily focused on technical services. So the examples you see on this slide, all of them include COVID-19 and/or a global crisis, which is COVID-19, within the title. So this is all recent COVID literature that's related to libraries, maybe about libraries in general, or reference, or library science education, but not necessarily about technical services. There are also citations from other fields, human resources and public health, in looking at remote work and workplace change during the pandemic. And then there are international perspectives that I can't tell you what they're about because I can't read them. I do see in the lower left, Biblioteca in one title. So I imagine that that one's about libraries, but I don't know for sure. So do any of these address technical services? I don't know. But I'm hoping that there is more research and more scholarship on the topic on the way, because within the last year and a half, I know I have seen a couple of surveys go out to tech services and cataloging listservs about these topics and about the experiences that people were having with remote work in tech services and in these related areas. So I'm hoping that those surveys got good responses and that those researchers are able to move forward with writing and publishing. So it just may take a little while. So where are we now? Are we back in the office? How has the experience of remote work in the pandemic shaped what we are doing now? And I want to do another Mentimeter here. So same thing as before, go to www.menti.com. There's a different code this time. It is 61578478. And when you go to that link and enter the code, you will again have the opportunity to answer two questions. The first one is remote work currently an option in your technical services department? And the second one is, what changes and challenges are you seeing related to remote work now? And these could be very long discussion questions. So we don't have a lot of time. Enter what you're comfortable entering, or what you're able to enter, and we will start taking a look at the results. So I will bring those up. This might take just a second. Again, that code is 61578478. And we're seeing some differences here. Some no's, some yeses, kind of, it has to be justified, yes, limited, on a limited basis, not regular remote work, yes, but partly, a lot of yeses. Yes for some, so maybe not all positions or all individuals, case by case basis, not everyone, currently working hybrid, so some in the office, some remote, no, yes. Catalogers are permanently remote if they desire. Interesting. 2 days a week at home. It's interesting to see some of these details attached to some of these with the context. Appreciate that. All right. So let's move on. Not for library staff, only for librarians. So there's some differences with equity there. Okay, interesting. Thank you all for these answers. Let's go on to the next question. So, what changes and challenges are we seeing now? Institutional acceptance, the possibility that it may be scaled back. Mixed view of remote work at various leadership levels. Restricting remote work to 1 day a week where the rest of the campus have broader options. Training takes a bit longer. Depends on institutional policies, staying connected, scheduling activities that would be best in person. Remote work has to be justifiable. You're no longer allowed remote work, although some of us wish to have it as an option. Less departmental cohesiveness, extra work to make us feel like a team in the same way. Different supervisors require different campus hours, it varies. Has to be justified and documented, convincing management, reluctance to change. So much easier to test access to e-resources. Interesting, yeah. Moving to a hybrid model, dealing with physical items, being able to do telework, that's great. Carting materials back and forth as a challenge for original cataloging. Tug of war between folks who want everything to be in person versus people who thrive in a hybrid setting. Some tasks can't be done remotely. Human colleague interaction being better on site. Miscommunications over email. Coordinating face-to-face, having to balance things, managing isolation, managing different communication needs. The lack of firm policy. Not seeing coworkers in person, making sure people have everything that they need. Differences with being on campus versus remote in terms of access and VPN, communication, some disconnect. Interesting. Okay, this is awesome. Thank you all for these answers. I really appreciate y'all chiming in on this. So let's go back to the slides and move on. So what I wanted to say about this is that in terms of where we are now, we have planning opportunities and hopefully an understanding of needs that we didn't have pre-pandemic. So hopefully in some or many situations, there has been time to develop institutional and departmental policies, guidelines and expectations relating to remote work and how to handle those arrangements. There may have been opportunities to develop those memorandums of understanding or memorandums of agreement that might be needed to put these arrangements in place. We have had a chance, hopefully, to learn more about technology and how to actually function and use new services and systems in the online environment and remote environment. We may have developed new procedures and workflows that allow us to do our work more efficiently or handle it differently remotely. And also, supervisors may now have more evidence about what positions and what individuals are able to function successfully in the remote environment. So that can help supervisors with planning. There are also some different challenges now. And some of this came up in the things that y'all wrote in the answer to that Menti. So navigating these new and changing hybrid situations. COVID hasn't gone away. We're in a very different situation than we were at this time last year or at this time 2 years ago, but things are still changing and there's still a level of uncertainty. And I know, at least in my institution, there are sometimes challenges around who's in the office when, what kind of meeting does this need to be? Is this going to be online? Is it going to be in person? If we're in the office, but this needs to be online, doing online meetings in an open workspace can be very challenging. So making sure that people have a place to go. And then this question of balancing business needs and personal interests when it comes to remote work. There's some give and take there. People may be interested in working remotely, but does it meet the business need for them to be doing so? So there can be some challenge for supervisors and institutions and individuals with that. What about the future? So we still don't know the full and lasting effects of these things that we've been through and continue to go through, and the associated changes that might come to libraries, to our work, our spaces, our services and users. I definitely do not have answers. I'm not a futurist. I do have questions. So some questions that I hope that we will get to learn more about as we move forward. How did library technical services units handle the transition to remote work? I would love to know more. I'm hoping that will appear more in the literature as we move forward. What challenges did we face? Did they align with the things that are represented in the pre-pandemic literature? Are there other challenges that were not represented? Were there innovations that were made? Did people create resources that might be able to be shared to help others? What lessons did we learn that others might be able to learn from as we were supporting and managing these transitions? How did we handle the provision of technology, the isolation of personnel, and some of these other issues that were reflected in the pre-pandemic literature as challenges? How will the pandemic affect library technical services units and operations in the long term? Will remote work remain common in tech services units, even after remote work and social distancing measures are no longer required or recommended? I saw a lot of yeses in that Menti in terms of answers about if people are working remotely. So it seems like at least now it is still somewhat common within this group. The thought I want to leave y'all with is that it's really hard to imagine remote work in a pre-internet or pre-fast internet time. I have a hard time imagining what that must have been like. But it's really not hard to imagine technical services personnel testing out new and different ways to get their work done, because we handle change all the time. New formats that we have to manage, new systems, new services. We're always having to learn new things. So change has always been part of technical services. And that's where I'm going to leave this. I would be glad to answer questions if y'all have them. And this slide deck does include further reading resources. So I've included links where I could to some of the articles that informed this column that I wrote. So if you're interested in reading more, consult the slides and you will have that opportunity. And again, thanks to all of our NC Serials colleagues for putting on this great conference and all the work that they've put into it. So I'm going to stop this share now. And if there are questions, feel free to ask.
Thank you so much, Anna. I just got to hand it to you. I am in awe of how much information you packed into such a small period of time.
Oh, thank you.
It's really impressive. We have time for questions because you were just on it. I also really appreciate this shout out to technical services ability to handle change. I was in a former life a cataloger, and I was trained by catalogers who were some of the first people to use the old WorldCat terminals, where everybody had to share the one terminal and you had to find other work to do while your record was uploading because it took so long. But that was a big deal back in the time. It was a huge shift in the way that we worked. So I think it's great that you pointed that out. Our Whova chat has been very active. My co-moderator, Erica Barnett, has been gathering a bunch of notes for me from Whova. So let me just look through these here. I also think you did a really wonderful job of articulating the higher level benefits and challenges of remote work. And some of our attendees in Whova have pointed out some specific challenges that I just want to kind of bring in and get your thoughts on. I'm just trying to find them in the notes. We have so much great stuff here. So someone pointed out that the huge shift to remote, which we didn't get to plan for or prepare for, kind of made us aware of things that we probably should have addressed beforehand, like DRM restrictions on ebooks. We got hit with that swam, and we knew DRM was a problem, but then it became a massive problem when people couldn't get to our real books. Also, the need to educate faculty on how our licenses work and how they restrict resources or allow resources to be open to other people. Do you have any thoughts on that? I just thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that's not something I'm going to be able to say a lot about because it's outside my area of expertise. But I think that point is something that I hope will be reflected in future publications and presentations around this topic, because as you said, that's not something that we had to contend with in the same way before this major shift. And it's a great point.
Everybody's probably getting great ideas for articles and presentations.
Yeah. Please publish on them. These are things that affected many people and will potentially continue to affect people. So learning about how people handled it is important.
So we have a couple of questions from the audience here. Jesse Griffin says, I'd be interested to know of the people whose library did not allow remote working. Is that because library leadership didn't permit it, or did university or college leadership not permit departments to allow working remotely? So that's probably more of a question for the attendees in chat. But Anna, I'm sure that you saw some of this in your lit review, that there were different levels of restrictions.
Yeah. One thing that, we sometimes talk about, failures are not necessarily reflected in the literature. And so that's kind of a gap potentially, like people wanting to implement remote work situations pre-pandemic or during the pandemic and not being supported, not being allowed to. I'm not sure that people are writing about that, but that actually potentially could be addressed in one of those studies that I think is going on now, or at least was going on when I saw the call for responses maybe within the last year. So yeah, that's a great point.
So stay tuned. So we have another question here. I'm curious about whether the challenge of socializing/isolation in the workplace is mitigated if coworkers have been at an institution and or working with one another in person for a while, in comparison to people new to the field or new to an institution. Did you find anything in your research about those factors from Abby Ritz?
Yeah, so I don't think that is reflected in the literature that I showed today, but in my own experience and recent writing with some colleagues, we did have some new hires in my library during the pandemic. And there is some forthcoming, a column forthcoming about that experience and the differences in terms of trying to welcome and give people their onboarding experience when they're having to receive that information fully or partially remotely. It is very different in terms of team building, and that was a major challenge. This column hasn't been published yet, but it is forthcoming, and it's specifically related to a case study with e-resources and hiring in that area. So yes, in my experience, that is a big challenge, and I think in my library, in my unit, there were a lot of us that had been working together for a long time. And so we had some of those relationships, those work relationships that had already been built. But for somebody who's new, who's coming in, building those relationships is going to be, it's going to be a different sort of experience. So yeah, that's a great point in terms of other challenges that people may face.
Yeah, it definitely is. I know we had new people come on and leave during the pandemic, and I want to think that it had nothing to do with us. There's just a lot of upheaval going on now, but I remember feeling bad for them because onboarding is hard anyway. Onboarding over Zoom is especially challenging.
Yeah. All of the things that you have in place for a new hire that might include, tours and like all of those sort of very in-person focused things can't be handled in the same way, but you still want to make sure that people are welcomed and they're given the information that they need and that they feel like they're becoming part of the team. And trying to do that remotely is a challenge.
Yeah. And speaking of challenges, you mentioned this in your session, the hybrid world plus the open workspace, right? That is really tough. We have a question here. How has the open workspace impacted productivity for individuals? Do individuals working in the open space get distracted or interrupted often? I would say that's a good question, pre or post pandemic.
Yeah.
Really. Is the literature showing anything about this?
So I don't think I found anything about the literature on that. I might have to do some more searching related to the impact of open offices on productivity. I bet that there is literature about that, though I'm not sure that it would be limited to just libraries. Anecdotally, in my own experience, it is more distracting potentially now because you've got people at their desks who they're doing their jobs, but they may be in a meeting at their desk in the open space. And you may have more than one person in a meeting at the same time in the open office. And so one thing that we do have, luckily, is some other spaces that people can go to where they can do meetings and have a door that they can shut. But yes, and that's not always, I mean, there's not, 17 of these spaces. Otherwise we would have, 17 offices. So yeah, I think handling that is a real challenge, making sure that people, and then the question about, or the piece about distraction and interruption, when you're in an open office, especially if the expectation kind of previously was that if you're at your desk, you can be interrupted. The expectation that may have carried over that, all right, you're there, like I can talk to you. And it's nobody's fault. It just is kind of a cultural thing. And you may be in a meeting.
Yeah. You might be in the middle of presenting at a virtual conference.
Yeah.
That is an excellent point. I had not even considered that. There are a lot of, well, we've already had to reset a lot of our internal and external communication tools, but expectations of availability need to be reset as well. So let me see, unless I am missing it, we don't have any more questions, but there's a lot of really interesting discussion. So if you have time, hop into the Whova chat afterwards. I think you'll find some stuff in here.
I'd love to see that.
Really, really helpful. A lot of people are talking about things that they've done to work comfortably from home, like taking home laptops and monitors, rearranging their spaces, things like that. Barb Svensson says that a lot of libraries are giving up spaces to other campus entities and also to other library related things. So that could be a factor in tech services becoming more remote because, we tend to be sort of behind the scenes a little bit, and shifting us into remote is a way to address space needs.
Yeah. There's definitely literature about that, remote locations for tech services. It's not stuff that I have gotten into a lot, but yes, that is something that we at UNCG are thinking about as we have an upcoming renovation and where are people going to be after or during this time.
So much fun in store for us still.
Yeah. Yeah,
But
a lot
we
to
can
learn.
do it because we're library employees. We can do anything.
Yeah. The point about change in tech services, I sometimes think tech services doesn't get enough credit for being able to handle change. There are, some stereotypes that,
Mhm.
they're the people who just do one thing, and if you go outside the rules, like they will burn it down quietly. But no, it's not. I mean, change has been a constant in tech services and will continue. So
Yes, preach. I have spent the bulk of my career in tech services, so I agree with you 100%. I gave into a little vocational awe earlier, saying library employees can do anything, but we're some pretty impressive people. I mean, we should give ourselves a pat on the back every now and again. So Anna, we're going to have to get wrapped up. I'm so
Yeah.
sorry because this has been really interesting. Thank you so
Yeah.
much for this session. Everyone, we really appreciate all of the questions and commentary. If you have any follow-up questions, please get in touch with Anna directly. Her email address is in her slides. We are going to have more fabulous content starting at 2 p.m. Eastern. So just see the agenda to link into that. And please remember that all of our sessions are being recorded, and we will make the recordings available in the coming weeks. So thank you again, Anna.
Thank you. I'll take care.
You too. Bye, everybody.